Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Introduction to the Operational Planning Process. My name is John Perry, and I am the Chief Design Officer at Ally Emergency Management. Before we get started, I just wanted to draw your attention to the participant controls to be found at the bottom of your viewing screen. The Q&A button may be used to post a specific question. During the second portion of this webinar, the Q&A phase, questions will be presented and our presenter, Dave, will do his best to answer them in real time. If your question is not answered, an answer will be provided in a follow-up email. There is also a chat button. Here you may post observations or comments that will be captured and, time permitting, also be responded to during the course of this webinar. Everyone is on mute and there are no video feeds from participants. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the Ally Emergency Management LinkedIn site and our YouTube channel in the days to come. You will receive a follow-up email with the link to the portal. The webinar has been divided into two phases. Phase one is the presentation. Phase two is the Q&A portion. Each will last approximately 30 minutes. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's webinar presenter, Dave Whittier. Dave has over 30 years of experience in technology, training, operations, and leadership. He has served as a telecommunications and technology planner for several significant special events, including the '97 APEC Summit, the '02 G8 Summit, and the 2010 Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games. As an employee of the City of Vancouver, Dave responded to numerous EOC activations as either the director or plans chief. Dave earned degrees in science and computer science from the University of Victoria and the University of Ottawa. A retired lieutenant colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces, he has commanded troops and planned telecommunications support to operations at home and overseas. One of his final postings was as a part-time instructor at the Canadian Army Command and Staff College, teaching operational planning. Dave has extensive experience in the Canadian military procurement system and has served as technical authority for multi-million-dollar IT and telecom projects. Dave, over to you.
Thanks, John, and welcome everyone to our webinar. Here's a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about. This is going to be a fairly high-level examination of the Canadian Armed Forces operational planning process. Usually going over this would take days, but we don't have days. I'm going to give you a quick introduction. I'm going to show you a link to a video series that I put together that can give you some more information. But we just want to sort of discuss the concept, how the OPP works, how it's laid out, and how it might be useful for you. We'll start with our obligatory quote. This, at the face of it, might seem like a bit of a contradiction, but for me, it makes sense. There's a saying in the military that no plan survives first contact. And what that means is you make a plan with a certain understanding of the factors that are going to go into it and where it is you need to go and what the environment that you're going to be operating in looks like. And as anyone who's made a plan knows, reality is never that way. Something is always going to be different. So the important thing about having a planning process then is the exercise that you go through to take a look at the factors and to describe the environment and to understand where you want to be and to articulate how you're going to get there is absolutely vital, because the situation might change. As John mentioned, my last gig with the Canadian Armed Forces was as a part-time instructor with the Canadian Army Command and Staff College, where I taught, among other things, the operational planning process. The military, like any other organization, and all of us in our lives or careers, end up being faced with problems. And some of them might be simple ones that we can solve on their own, and some of them might be more complicated, and we might have to have a group of people or a group of teams dedicating their time and attention and effort into helping us solve this problem. There's all kinds of different planning processes or planning methodologies that exist in the literature. Which one you pick, I think, probably depends on your personality and your background and experience and your own corporate culture. But I think there's a lot going for this process, which is why we put the webinar together and which is why we want to share it with you. What is operational planning? In its simplest form, operational planning is a tool set. It's a bunch of techniques and practices that you can use to consider a problem and to come up with a plan to solve it. And if that tool set is organized cleverly, then it can be used to deal with a wide variety of issues, including strategic and operational level planning. I want to focus this discussion on the operational side, but I thought it was important to spend some time very quickly and distinguish between what I mean by a strategic plan and what I mean by an operational plan. In general terms, a strategic plan guides your organization's future over a longer time period, probably 3 to 5 years. It articulates your organization's goals and visions and becomes a general guide for the management and operation of the organization at a high level, but it doesn't have that level of detail. Conversely, an operational level plan is very much focused on the detail. It is a plan for the day-to-day management of your organization, usually done in a 1-year time frame, but we're going to discuss instances where plans are written in response or in preparation for an event or as a contingency. And the operational plan should always reference to the strategic plan because it is the roadmap to execute the vision and the organizational guideline that the strategic plan articulates. The Canadian Armed Forces operational planning process has been developed over many years, and it's designed to do exactly what it was I was talking about earlier. It is a problem-solving tool set which allows a number of different individuals to take different parts of a problem and put the solution together in an environment that is often complicated and multidimensional and has a whole lot of moving parts, namely the modern battlefield. And I don't want to go too much into the military side of it, but imagine an operation where you've got thousands of soldiers and or dozens of ships and airframes, and they're all coordinating their actions to achieve a specific objective. And the planning for that, you can imagine how complicated that is. So the operational planning process allows you to pulse, and it allows you to get people to work together, go off and do their work separately, come back together, and it follows a very specific set of activities. What we're looking at here are the stages of the operational planning process, and it's designed to run as a never-ending evolution. So, for example, at the bottom of those series of arrows, you've got a box that says plan review, and the plan review can very often become part of the trigger for the initiation of a new operational planning process. The takeaway, I think, for us as planners is don't fall in love with your plan because it's always going to be an iterative process. The plan is going to change over time, and the situation might change. So let's talk a little bit about the first stage of the operational planning process, and that would be the initiation stage. And that answers the question, what is happening? Consider this as being the alarm bell that triggers the OPP. It means that the situation has changed enough that you realize the problem exists, or if you're in a larger organization with a hierarchical structure, you may have been given a task from your boss to solve a problem, or you may have become aware of an opportunity or a threat. And any one of these can start an iteration of the planning process. Because of the different variation in the triggers, I think the takeaway from a planning perspective is you as planners, or we as planners, need to be aware of what is going on not only within our organization, but outside of our organization. For each of the stages, I'm going to spend some time and describe what the stage is, and then I'm going to talk about the output. So for the initiation stage, the output is really in terms of information that you can share. In a military context, for anyone who's got a bit of a background there, it would be a warning order, which is really what you think the organization is going to be doing to solve a problem. As much information as you can share about the background and the situation. If it is quite clear that there are some tasks that are going to need to be executed regardless of what the final plan is, this is the time to share it. Any key timings, especially things to do with sustainment and logistics, because sometimes those have a longer lead time to get going. The whole idea behind this is when you've got a team, and the team may not be intimately involved in the planning, this allows them to go out and do some concurrent activity so that they are aligned and prepared for you as the planning process carries on. The next stage is the orientation stage, which answers the question, do I understand the problem and the requirements for a solution? So the primary objective of the orientation stage is shared understanding. This is where the analysis and the understanding take place. The reason being, it's a common pitfall, I guess, that people encounter when they come up with a problem, is they want to jump right to the tactics. You know, from the ICS, you've got your objectives and your strategies and your tactics, and they want to jump right to, all right, let's get resources and go to the problem. If you don't spend the time to understand the problem, you could very well likely be going in the wrong direction. The kind of things we're considering in the orientation phase is the nature of the problem facing us, what causes the problem, what are the factors and conditions, what would success look like, what's expected of us if we're part of a larger organization, and where do our actions fit into the big picture. If you have time, there's a video in the group of videos that I'm going to share the link to later about assessing the environment, and it gives you a better idea of the kind of things you should be thinking of when you are crafting the orientation. From the orientation stage, you should have things like your mission statement, identifying your critical task, the task that if you don't execute that, you're not going to be able to achieve your mission. Information requirements means that as you're going through your planning process, you probably won't have all of the information you have to make a decision. What we do is we make assumptions that will allow us to carry on with planning, but at some point you're going to have to confirm those information requirements. I mentioned analysis of rivals. There's sort of the military field of that when we talk about, you know, in the military context, we're interested in what the enemy's doing. There are situations where there is a person or a thing or event that's actually trying to be contrary to what you're trying to achieve. In a business environment, it could be a competitor. For an emergency management context, it could be a fire or a flood. What's on everyone's mind these days would be COVID-19. And we know enough about COVID from the government models that we can include that into courses of action, for example, when we're crafting our own company's future in a COVID environment. You need to be able to understand where you're going to accept risk, how to mitigate it, relationship with other organizations, and I can't stress this enough, that whole logistical preparation thing. The other output to the orientation stage should be a briefing. If you're part of the larger team and you were given this task by your boss, this is the time to back brief your boss to make sure that they understand and agree with some of the decisions you've made on mission statement, critical task, and that thing, the sort of thing. Because if you go off track, now's the time to try to rectify that. There'll also be a briefing for the staff that are involved in planning and staff that you may bring in later that are going to be involved in the execution. The next is course of action development, which answers the question, what options are there for solving the problem and which option is best? So once you understand the nature of the problem and the requirement for the solution, and you've got an understanding of some of the tasks that are going to have to be done to solve this problem, you can start looking at options. We call these options courses of action. I'll probably refer to them as COAs. And a COA is simply an articulated possibility that provides the essential elements for a plan, but is not actually as well developed as a plan must be. The reason we develop COAs is you always want to have different options because there's always more than one way to skin a cat or solve a problem. And we're going to take these COAs and we're going to compare them against each other. And we're going to compare them against our adversary, our COVID model, our fire projections, what have you. And from that, we're going to decide which course of action has the best likelihood of actually solving the problem. So to develop a COA, you want to compile all the tasks you've identified. You want to identify the resources available for each task, and you want to start looking at the logical sequence to execute these tasks in order to achieve your mission. The output in this stage is going to be a ranking of the courses of action. One of the best ways to do that is actually to wargame it. And we'll talk a little bit about the wargame process later on in the presentation, but it allows you to compare your COAs step by step against each other and against any competitors if such exists. You would use predetermined criteria. What aspects are important to you in order to achieve your mission, and then you would rank those COAs using those criteria and compare them against each other. The next stage is plan development. How do I translate the chosen solution into a plan for action? So it begins with the decision as to which course of action you're going to choose, and it's going to be developed into a plan for final execution. One of the best ways to develop this plan, as with one of the best ways to pick the best COA, is to wargame it. The big advantage of a wargame is it enables your planning team to visualize your operation and its critical parts. You're either going to compare the courses of action against each other, or you're going to compare your selected course of action against the environment and against your competitor. But this is where you really dig into the nuts and bolts and give your team an opportunity to get familiar with the operation, the major muscle movements, how the pieces are going to move on the chessboard, whatever analogy you want to use. This is how you do it. There is no set way of running a war game. The military's got a process that it prefers. You can use anything you want as long as it's got some component parts, like you need to start off with a clearly stated purpose and some guidance so people understand the rules of the game and how they're going to conduct this war game. There should be somebody representing different aspects of the environment and the teams and the players. So you might have somebody representing the team you're employing to solve the problem. If you've got a large number of teams, you may have a number of people. If you are talking about a plan, for example, to deal with COVID, or to move your company forward in a COVID environment. You might assign somebody to be familiar with the different models so that they can talk to that. You're going to break the war game down into a number of turns where each side articulates what they were going to do during that particular turn. So you need to agree ahead of time what the timelines for those turns are, the method of play, and you want to have a clear set of rules for capturing the findings so that you can feed them back into your plan. So once the plan development stage is done, you've war-gamed it all out, there's really two things that you've got. You've got plan and you've got a direction. And the difference between the two is the plan is the detailed instruction for proposed activity. But if it's something like a contingency plan, you could put it on the shelf and it could be there for years, you know, until a particular trigger's been hit, until that incident happens, until the time has passed. The direction is slightly different from the plan itself because it is how you take the plan and activate the team to go out and execute the plan. So saying to, you know, John, all right, here's the plan, you're going to fulfill this part of it. Cam, you're going to do this bit, et cetera, et cetera. The final stage of the OPP is the plan review. And that answers the question, is my plan still relevant? And we talked earlier about the fact that the OPP never stops. It just keeps on going in this cyclical manner. And you've got to constantly compare that against the changing reality of the problem that the plan was designed to solve. If you don't, it becomes static, it then becomes stagnant, and at some point, it's no longer going to be applicable. There are two types of plan review, and they are progress review and periodic review. So progress review really applies to a plan that you're executing right now. And it's an opportunity for you to take a look at how the execution is unfolded or unfolding in the context of what you think was going to happen. If the environment has changed a little bit from what your planning assumptions were, then you may have to tweak the plan on the fly, go in a slightly different direction, adjust milestones, what have you. A periodic review is actually intended to take a look at the plan before its implementation. So if you have a contingency plan for your basement flooding, for example, and your basement may not flood for 10 years, it's a really, really good idea to dig that thing out once a year, dust it off, take a look at it. You could even war game it and ensure that the planning assumptions that you put into that plan when you first put it together still make sense and they're still relevant. And we close with our obligatory quote. Do not try to make circumstances fit your plans. Make plans that fit the circumstances. That is a very, very, very quick overview of the operational planning process. I mentioned earlier that we have a video series. It is 7 parts of about 15 minutes a piece, so about an hour and 40 that kind of goes in a bit more detail into what I've been talking about. And if you're interested in using the OPP in your own organization, that's probably good because you get a different or next level of clarity on it. I've included a link here that you get when you get the final copy of the video. There's also a link to the playlist in the original invitation that went out. Your other option is you can send me an email, dave.whittier@yourally.ca, or you can take a look at our website, which has this and some other interesting resources that might be useful for you. So that is it. I'm going to pass it back to John now. Thank you very
Thanks,
much for your
Dave.
time and attention.
Yeah, cheers, Dave. So now that concludes the first portion of the webinar, and now we're going to transition into the second portion, which is Q&A. And I'm going to pass it over to Cam Kowalski, who will have been capturing questions that have been presented during the course of the first part. And over to you, Cam.
Thank you, John. It's nice to be sitting on this side rather than the hot seat where Dave is right now. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in, and they are quite interesting. So I'll start with the shortest one, but it may entail the longest answer. Given the resources and time constraints that organizations are over or under right now, how long does it take ballpark from start to finish to complete the OPP as you've given the overview on?
Yeah, that'll be a short answer. It depends. all the best questions. That's a really good question, and there are a number of things that would contribute to how long it would take to go through this cycle. The complexity of the problem would have an impact. The number of people that you've got helping you do the planning, how familiar they are with the process, all of those would have an impact on how long it would take to run through a complete OPP. Just for context, when we teach young Army captains this process, we take them all to Kingston and we run an exercise called Exercise Final Drive. And really what it is it is just one OPP cycle after another. And the problem becomes more complicated and the time they have becomes shorter and shorter. At the beginning, it would take them 2 days to run through this whole OPP cycle. By the end of the week, they're doing it in about 8 hours. But they've had a lot of real in-depth training and practice, and we put a lot of pressure on them. And you know, they sort of understand the context. So I don't know if that helps or not, but you know, it's the other thing I guess you want to consider is if you are familiar with the process, then you know where you can take shortcuts. It's almost like a martial art. You know, you learn the katas in great detail at the beginning. By the time you become a master, you're just sort of doing your thing. I guess that's probably the best I can do with that one.
Yeah, certainly it's not an easy question to answer because, again, like you say, it's gauged on what your experience level is and who you've got around you, and if they've done it before, and if you're walking through someone that is new to the process, then you're going to have to, you know, manage that person and their expectations in an instructional type of avenue. Okay, second question, and this speaks to the 5 stages of the OPP itself, and I think it aligns nicely with what's happening in the world right now with COVID-19 specifically, in that the virus is continually changing, or information is changing, or input is changing to your organization. So when you're underway in your OPP and you get something substantial which has happened, which is going to impact your 5 stages of the plan, what is the recommended action? And the follow-up question to that is, do you dismiss the first OPP, or do you run it concurrently with a second OPP because of the new information that's received?
That's a really good question, and I'm not going to answer it by saying it depends. I wouldn't recommend running 2 concurrent cycles of the OPP to solve the problem. I think what you need to do is you want to decide whether or not you can adjust on the fly and carry on with the work you've done up to that point, or if you need to sort of scrap it and start a new one, brand new one, fresh. And for me, I'd take a look at the mission statement that you derived in the earlier portion of the OPP and see if the mission statement still makes sense after looking at whatever change happened. What could we use an example? So, okay, so let's say there's like a cargo truck that's driven into the ditch, and your mission is to get all of the pallets out. Okay, so that's the planning cycle that you're working towards, and then all of a sudden the truck explodes and it's on fire. Okay, so you can't get in there anymore to get the pallets out. The mission no longer makes sense because of these changing circumstances. Now you have to switch gears, pivot, and talk about a firefighting mission rather than a getting the pallets out of the truck mission. So yeah, my advice would be take a look at the mission. Does it still make sense in the light of the changing circumstances? And then you either adjust your planning with the new information, or you just start from scratch.
And I'm gathering from that analogy that it was John Perry that was probably driving that truck that caused that crash in the pallet. So
depends on what was in the pallets.
Yes, indeed. Okay, now we've got a couple questions related to the ICS perspective versus the military OPP perspective, and I think they're valid in that you know, the military would capture the questions, the concepts in their language, and it may be different from what we teach at, say, the Justice Institute and what we use for civilian organization. So the OPP itself, who would that fall under the guise of? Would that be the EOC director that's leading that, and the planning chief that's ultimately responsible for it because of the documentation piece of it? Or does that work differently from the concept or from what you've seen from a military perspective?
Yeah, I'm trying to noodle that one through, because a lot of the times, if you're in an EOC, you are working with a previously established contingency plan. And I think if it was me and I was presented with a problem that required a planning cycle like that, and I'm putting myself in the shoes of the director. I think I would be very involved with the initiation and the beginning of the orientation phase as the director. So I'd want to make sure everybody's aligned to the problem, and I would want to have a personal hand in crafting the mission statement of this particular planning process. And then I would probably hand it over to the plans chief to work with the rest of the staff. And the touch points between me and the plans chief or the planning team would be aligned with those outputs that I was talking about after various portions of the OPP. So there's the back briefs after the orientation stage, for example, and the decision brief after the course of action development stage. So that's probably how I would manage it from an EOC perspective.
Yeah, and as you were answering that, I was kind of just thinking about that along the same lines of and teaching the incident command structure and system through the JI. Again, it's the development of the plan is done by a bunch of people, but it's under the leadership of the planning chief, who captures the documentation. But again, there's input from various areas within the EOC itself. So I think that aligns nicely with the way that you did answer that. And I would agree with that from a philosophical standpoint, that that's how I would execute the plan as well, given the same information if I was running a civilian EOC versus in the military context. So yeah, I think that that covers that. So let's again, this is, again, it's a military versus a civilian context, but another valid question that came up was the wargaming versus tabletop exercise, full-scale exercise. Can you differentiate between the two of those and tell me how they align with the structure of what the military does versus what the structure I would do within my own private or corporate organization.
Yeah. Okay. So as we kind of discussed in the presentation, there's two places where the wargaming can be really, really useful. And one is when you're trying to decide which course of action is best to get you down the road to success. And then the other time you would use a war game is when you've selected your course of action. Now you're trying to build a plan out of it, and you want to war game it to see if there's any gaps or overlaps or any kind of risks that you didn't see when you were first putting it together. And so when you look at it in terms of intent, a war game, a planned war game, is kind of similar to a tabletop exercise, isn't it? Because the intent of a tabletop exercise is to take the plan, practice it, see if there is any opportunities or any gaps, any opportunities for improvement, and get people familiar with it. And that's kind of like what the plan war game is doing too. You know, you're testing the plan with a view to coming up with a more refined product. I think the execution is a little bit different. So, you know, in a tabletop, you've got a scenario, and you've probably had a discussion about exercise objectives and whatnot, and what decisions you want to try and get to. And then the facilitator would have these injects, like putting new information in during the course of the tabletop, just so that people can move around in the plan and get more familiar with it and test the plan. And the war game, although it's scenario based, I think it's a bit more rigid because you've got these turns, right? So, you know, we're going to do this in 3 turns. Each turn will take 20 minutes and represent, I don't know, 5 hours on the ground, that sort of thing. And the other thing that you see in a war game that you don't necessarily see in a tabletop is a war game can be umpired, because you've got a situation where you have people playing roles, right? So I'm playing the role of the police, I'm playing the role of the fire, I'm the fire department, I'm playing the role of the ambulance, this guy's playing the role of the interface fire, and they're going to talk about what their actions would be during that particular role, and sometimes they don't always agree. So it's appropriate in a war game to have an umpire come in and sort of adjudicate so you can move on. If you have that kind of discussion in a tabletop, probably the facilitator would just put it in the parking lot and have a more detailed discussion about it later. So yeah, very much the same. I think that there are some differences off the top of my head. Good question.
Yeah, I think there's some value, because oftentimes, and I've been through so many tabletop exercises and full scale exercises, that you have a pressing point that is put in the parking lot, and you don't really deal with it until kind of at the end of the day, where people have lost their momentum. And to have somebody that's able to adjudicate that in real time, I see great value in that. If you could apply that and you have the manpower to be able to do that during a tabletop exercise or a full-scale exercise. So very interesting. Okay, another one that came up, and this again, I dealt with this question last time when I did the webinar on the future planning state, for those of you that participated in that. But again, it rings true, and it comes up once again for the operational planning process, and that is the template or the guide for using this in a civilian environment. Again, we always look to see what the lessons learned or the best practices from other organizations are. So do you have something to suggest that can point people towards a good higher guidance for actualizing what you just have described in the last half hour?
Yeah, I like my YouTube channel. No, it's a good question. And you know, because of my experience with the OPP and operational planning on the military side, I think it's awesome. I think it's powerful, it's flexible, it's modular, it can be adapted to just about any problem with any number of people. So there's a lot of really good advantages to it. You know, I have a book called the OPP Handbook. It was actually put out by the Army Staff College, but of course it's super military, and there's really no point in me in a business or non-military emergency management context to spend time and talking about, you know, intelligence preparation of the battlefield, which is a big thing in the Staff College book. So a lot of this and the video series that I put through was me just going through the process and the handbook and kind of demilitarizing it, I guess, for lack of a better word, and trying to pull out the principles and the activities and the outputs and the relationships and that sort of thing without being bogged down in a lot of acronyms and jargon and military specific terminology. So the short answer is the only template or guide that I'm aware of is the stuff that I've already made up, and people can get a good flavor for that on the video series. And if they really think it's something that they want to explore further, they can probably give me a call and we can have a discussion and see if, you know, I can help them out.
Yeah, I think that's an action item for the post-webinar follow-up for John. As a takeaway, we can include the link to what's on the last slide of the webinar slide deck, Dave, and reference the YouTube link, because there's some great lessons in what you did with those YouTube videos, and they're short, they're succinct enough that you can watch them all together or in isolation over a several-day period. So thank you for that. We'll include that moving forward. And last question that I have, and again, it relates to the changing landscape of the OPP. It's about the planning, the cyclical nature of the OPP process. When the conditions change, do you go back to the beginning, or is there certain steps that you can say we've already got these understood and we can go to step 3 of the 5-stage process, or do we always have to go back to square one?
Yeah, no, a good question, and it's kind of like the one we sort of dealt with something similar earlier on, and I think probably the same answer is appropriate. I think you need to look at it in the context of the mission statement, and if the conditions change to the point where the mission doesn't make any sense anymore, then you probably have to redo it from scratch. Otherwise, you can amend it on the fly and just incorporate the new information.
Okay. Yeah, I would concur. Yeah, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. If there's good stuff in there, then continue to use it and incorporate it into the new plan based on the new circumstances. So thank you, Dave. Those are all the questions that I've got. So I'm going to throw it back to John.
Thanks, Cam. All right, so that concludes the second portion of the webinar. And I do want to sincerely thank Dave for putting this one together. This is a condensed version of a condensed version of a condensed version of formal training. Put it in context, the formal training takes, well, for a reservist, a good 8 to 9 months of your life. Dave has managed to condense that, as he said, into 7 15-minute videos. Now he's managed to condense that into 1 half-hour presentation. The reality is that this is a very complicated subject, very intricate, and to a large degree, because of the formal training, the military is very good at doing it. Recently, the British National Health Service, the NHS, stated that how appreciative they were when the British military started to augment their health resources in the planning for response to COVID-19, because they really are masters at planning. It's something anyone who's served in the military will know, that if you're not planning, training, and if you're not training, then you're exercising. So constant cycle, and it's part of military DNA. Military veterans will attest to. So again, I just want to say thank you today for that. We will be pushing out emails to everyone, all the participants today, and it will include the link, an easy link to that very long, convoluted YouTube channel, where you can review the videos Dave alluded to. Included in the email will also be a survey where you'll have an opportunity to link through and select some future topics. We'll be presenting 4 or 5 future topics, just to make sure that our topics are relevant to you, the participant, as this one was. This came up as a subject that garnered interest. And thank you very much, everyone, for taking time out of all your very busy schedules to sit with us here today. And that concludes this webinar, the introduction to the operational planning process. Keep well, everyone. Thank you.